We're good? All right. Good morning, everyone. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Lord, thanks for this day. Thank you for St. Albans. Thank you that we are just across the way from a big university that lets us hear from really incredible people really easily and cheaply, may I add. Thank you for this church. Thank you for giving us brains to think deeply about hard things and know that you are the God who extends mercy, who brings justice, and who never leaves us alone. Amen. All right, today is our final summer Sunday school, which is crazy. July 31st, that freaks me out a little bit, but maybe everyone else is feeling great about that. So just as a reminder, we did theology our first week, right? We did history our second week. We did Bible our third week, and now we are in the realm of action, of ethics, which means theology working itself out in the world today in our fourth week. And it is my honor to have today one of my former professors. I won't say what grades he gave me. Jonathan Tran, who is Professor of Philosophical Theology at Baylor. He's also some fancy chair now. I didn't put that one up, but big deal, another big deal. We seem to have a lot of those. And he has written this book called Asian Americans and the Spirit of Racial Capitalism. And if y'all are on Twitter, you will know that this book has gotten quite a bit of attention. Well deserved, I think. But let us invite Jonathan Tran to come up. I always call him Tran, that's why I'm stumbling over this. Let's invite Tran to come up and speak to us about his new book.
Thank you, Dr. Toombs. The main thing I heard in her introduction was the word cheap, which is befitting a book that ends with the word capitalism. So it's really great to be here at your church. I preached here, I think it was probably before your sophomore year, Daniel, at Baylor. Father Zimmerman had asked me to preach back when you all were in the smaller chapel. So really great to be back with you. Our family is good friends with the Zimmerman family. My daughter Talia, who isn't here, she's at our church, or her church, UBC, is really good friends with Abby. So really grateful to be with you all. Which basically meant me and Aaron spent a lot of time texting each other during the very long high school graduation. So anyways, really great to be with Dr. Toombs, Rachel, who is, I can't say her grades, but they were very good grades. And it's really great to see her flourishing in a different capacity, but also continuing to do the great things she does with her, large brain and this kind of thing. So grateful to be here to talk about the book. I'm here with my wife, who the book is dedicated to. I don't think I've spoken a lot about the book, but mostly in places outside of Waco. So this is one of the very first times I think she gets to hear about the book. And then my son made an amazing, David, who's a rising 10th grader at Rappaport. He made an amazing YouTube video about the making of the book. So if you ever want to see that, it's a pretty cool rendition of kind of how the book came to be. So let me say a few things about the main goals of the book, and I think kind of what it's tried to do in the world. And I'll just say three things. I'll focus on the part related to church, since we're in this context. And then I'm really interested in kind of conversation with you all. So I'll just take about 15, 20 minutes to say some things about the book. So the book has three large goals, and the conversation about the book online, or as I've done different lectures or visited different communities, have really tended to focus on these three. So I've been pretty happy that the three things I was hoping the book would do, at least it generated conversation around those three things. So the first thing it tries to do is to recast how we think about race and racism. So I think we tend to think about race and racism in America along the lines of something like this. We think racism, the problem of racism, or say the phenomenon of racism, is primarily something individual, right? someone has stereotypes or views of another race. Those views are bad or incorrect. They amount to certain kinds of attitudes we may have to another race. So someone may see an Asian person and think, well, they are the originators of a virus, so we associate them with virus, and then we treat them negatively. We experience people of color around Waco. We think they're dangerous or not intelligent or what have you. And so this account of racism is individual. It's usually about bad beliefs we have about other people. What's dangerous about this kind of racism in this rendition of things, what's dangerous about racism here is that these bad beliefs translate into bad behavior. So we think something inaccurate about someone, and then it leads to bad behavior, usually forms of discrimination or other kinds of harms to that person. So I think my Asian neighbor is, the progenitor of the virus, so I start avoiding their family. I give them dirty looks when I pull out of my house and I see them, so on and so forth. In this story, or in this kind of racism, which I think is the general view of racism in America, we then worry about these bad beliefs, these bad behaviors rising to the level of structures and systems. They begin to infect our institutions. We call this structural or institutional racism. And so, for example, if we think, certain people of color are not naturally intelligent, right? That begins with a bad belief. It translates into interpersonal behavior, and then third, it rises to the level of institutional implementation, right? It begins to show up in our schools, how cities invest in individuals or individual communities and stuff like this. So that's what we tend to think racism is. And I try to suggest that racism, that story of racism largely has it backwards. That racism doesn't begin as an individual affair, originating in bad beliefs, then rising to the level of behavior in institutions, right? Again, on that rendition, if that's what racism is, what would anti-racism be? It would be primarily to correct the source material of the racism, change individual attitudes and behaviors, and hopefully, therefore, change institutions. And you see this account of anti-racism if you look at many of the diversity initiatives occurring at the educational level, the city level, the institutional level, right? So if you look at most Fortune 500 companies in America, there's these diversity initiatives, and that's really what they're trying to do, is correct these individual behaviors. They're trying to ferret out the racism inside you and then correct it. And this account of racism you also see, of course, in social media. The idea is this racism is this thing out there, and then social media will sometimes catch you in the act of your racism, and then it calls you out and shames you and pushes you to the margins of polite society and this kind of thing. Okay, so that whole account I think has it backwards. It's not that racism originates with individual bad beliefs, translates into behavior, and then rises to the level of structures and systems. In my account, racism is always structural and systemic. And the individual attitudes and behaviors are largely byproducts of a system that cultivates, produces, engenders, creates those attitudes and behaviors. Racism, in my account, is a world of extraordinary, often breathtaking exploitation and inequality that then uses race to justify that world. So rather than driving around Waco, and as we all know, Waco has exceptionally high levels of poverty, nearly 30%, almost all of which accrue disproportionately to people of color. So you live in a world like that, and rather than saying something like, why would we organize our society that these people live with such abject poverty, that this group of people clearly and obviously and consistently don't have access to health care, education, employment in the way others do? Why would we organize and allow a society to go on like that? Rather than asking that kind of question, which of course inevitably raises the question of how am I contributing to that and benefiting from that society, rather than asking those sets of incredibly inconvenient questions. What we do is we gaslight the people suffering those inequalities. So rather than those realities forcing a set of questions in us about our society that would make us rethink our society, instead we gaslight the people suffering them, right? And so we drive around Waco, we go to East Waco where David goes to school, we notice, lack of investment, lack of health care, lack of basic infrastructures like things like finance. And we say, instead of saying, what is wrong that we've allowed this to go on like this? We say, oh, it's them. It's who they are. They're to blame. It's something natural to them. It's their race. I think that's how racism operates in the West, or in the worlds in which race came or was created as a category. And when you look at the history of race language, right, it doesn't really begin in, let's say, the last 1,000 years in the kind of lineage of European culture. It doesn't begin primarily as a biological distinction. People didn't create race because they were trying to figure out categories to differentiate people biologically. Race largely began as a distinction of property, of labor, of who would have access. And race was created as an ideological cover on top of that. So Geraldine Hang, who's a scholar over here at the University of Texas, wrote a book about the origins of race in medieval European culture. And guess what? It didn't have anything to do with, say, sub-Saharan Africans. It had to do with distinctions among what we would now call white people, that is, Jews and Christians. And the distinction wasn't created along religious lines. The distinction was created to decide who could own property and who couldn't. Namely, Jews could not own property in medieval Christian Europe, right? Because, well, obviously it benefited the political economic structure, but the race stuff was thrown on top to justify an unequal state of affairs. You see the same thing in Europe, right, with the creation of how race was used, say, in England. This is Cedric Robinson on his book in Black Marxism, when he says, when you look at what happens in England, race wasn't, again, to distinguish European white people from sub-Saharan African black people. Race was created to decide different levels of labor among white people in Europe. Who's going to have access to property? What kind of laborers are going to be permanent versus indentured? Right? These were distinctions that were made to suit a political economy of exploitation and domination. Race was thrown on top. You see almost the same thing in colonial America around who is decided as being eligible for indentured forms of labor versus, say, permanent forms of labor. And then the race language was used to justify it. That's our history, and I think we still largely operate in these terms. That racism in our society is used as a kind of cover, a layer of respectability to lend weight or credence or sustainability to a system of, as I described, an extraordinary inequality and exploitation where race comes on top. If this description is right, then most of what goes by the name of anti-racism in our society not only distracts from the primary contributors of racism, but in some great sense contribute to them. Right? If we have distracted ourselves by saying race is primarily an individual affair and left to the side systems and structures, then all those attempts, right, think of all those diversity initiatives in universities and companies and churches, to try to change the source material and individual beliefs largely misses the point. And the power of those things is not simply that they distract, they further embed structures and systems of inequality. Maybe the strongest way of saying this is that a lot of the diversity initiatives, say at universities, don't do anything to change the systems within those institutions. If anything, they make us feel better about them insofar as we dress them up with, say, certain requisite identities. We say, well, X university can't be too bad because they have an Asian professor there. But as we know, colleges and universities are one of the primary gatekeepers to a society that is largely based on this inequality. But we're made to feel better about said university. Why? Because there's people of color, right? This critique, by the way, is not original to me. None of the account of racism is original to me. Black Marxists have been saying this for over 100 years in this country. Why? Because to Black Marxists, to Black intellectuals, right, the great Black intellectual tradition, they said from the beginning, of course it's not about us. There's no question of our humanity here. The question is, why have people decided to think this way, and what does it benefit our society? Right, so it's, like I say, a certain kind of application of this is oftentimes when we think about slavery, right, of course, Waco and Central Texas and the South more broadly, deep history of chattel slavery, one of the ways we tend to think about it, again, has it backwards. We sometimes say something like, well, white people enslaved black people because they didn't think they were human and therefore enslaved them. This view would suggest that slavery largely rests on a category mistake. Like some people got their metaphysics wrong about what a person is. That largely has it backwards. The tragedy of American chattel slavery is in large part not that some people mistaked black people for not human and enslaved them. The deep moral tragedy is that these folks enslaved them knowing fully well they were human. Right? I mean, the technologies of slavery, just think how slavery operated in terms of forms of terror, was entirely predicated on these people being fully human. Right? You enslaved people knowing they're fully human, and you threw race categories on top to lend it a veneer of respectability. So the first thing the book tries to do is to try to change the way we think about racism, to move it from what I describe as a largely identitarian story about ascriptive racial identities, and then to try to change it to look at the larger political economies out of which we tended to think about issues of race. If I'm right, then one of the things we need to do is drastically dial down the power of racial identity in our stories. We need to stop thinking that race describes something essential in persons and that race can be used to explain things. Maybe a controversial way of saying this is that when we think of, say, when we anti-racists think of white people, we need to distinguish between the things that white people have done and distinguishing that from the belief that they did it because they're white people. That's a really critically important distinction, but one I think the Black Marxists thought we would have gotten to 100 years later, and I think they would be awfully surprised that we've actually largely gone in the other way. We've largely doubled down on race identity as an explanatory concept. We in some ways, we may believe the race story more now, more than we ever have. And one of the tragedies, I think, is that anti-racism is one of the primary contributors to this problematic reality. So that's the first thing I do in the book. And you can imagine there's been a lot of conversation around that argument. But I always try to say, well, it's not really original to me. Other people have been saying this. You can imagine one of the points of controversy there is A, if you ascribe to the first version of racism, you don't like that. And B, it sounds a little bit like I'm trying to get rid of race as a category, which I kind of am. But I think for some people that seems to suggest that I don't fully appreciate the power of racism. Whereas what I've tried to do, I think, is to actually show people materially how it works. So the second thing I do in the book is I try to place Asian Americans as a conceptual lens through which you come to realize these things. So the first part of this goal of the book, I imagine and I hope is largely familiar to you all. and that you either implicitly, intuitively already believe what I'm saying, or at least have thought about it. The second one may not be if you're not Asian American. And if I'm writing the book, that's largely not an accident. The reality is that in American race politics, and again, this is on full display at any university, that the reality of American race politics is almost entirely a white and black affair. That when we think about race and we think about anti-racism and our remedies and our proposals, it's a story entirely about white people in relationship to black people. And I want to be clear that there is something incredibly important and correct about that. The story of what white people have done to black people in the name of race and racism is a story that I think we've really only begun to scratch the surface on. And so we need to continue to tell that story. But one of the things I try to say is the way we tell that story marginalizes other people who have suffered racism because they just don't fit on it. The way I describe it is, and I try to say a little bit about my own biography at the beginning of the book, is I grew up and I experienced just a ton of racism. I came to America after the Vietnam War as a war refugee, and America had experienced 3 subsequent wars with Asian countries. In other words, they had been taught, ingrained in their minds, to see people like me as perilous and dangerous. And so I just experienced racism just on a regular basis. It was therefore incredibly surprising to me that when I entered the academy, and whenever people talked about racism, my story simply did not come on the register. Or if I did come up as a person of color, it's not simply that I didn't count like in a secondary or tertiary way. I counted in a suspicious way. Because, right, on the one hand, there's something right about that because Asians have been both perpetrators and victims of racism. But the more important thing is the way we tell the story marginalize people like me. And so, as I describe in the book, I was first marginalized by racism, and then I was marginalized by anti-racism. What I try to do in the book is to take a political limitation, say the political pain of suffering that, which is, this is, I think, pretty true among a lot of Asian Americans, or say Latinx people on university campuses. I try to take the pain of being put on the margins and turn that into a conceptual or perceptual advantage. In other words, I try to ask, what can we see about the conversation about race and racism from the margins that we can't see at the center of it, right? And so what I then, that opened up into a whole series of questions about the political economy, and I do a story, I found a really fascinating history about Chinese people who migrated to the South after Reconstruction. And what were they doing in the South? Well, white plantation owners were trying to figure out a way to replace freed African Americans, emancipated African Americans. And so I look at the history of these Chinese in nearby Mississippi and try to think about how race is operating and what it says about the entire race reality in America. So that's the second thing the book does. And you can imagine there's also been controversies or some controversy around the second point of the book, both among those who are Asian American. I think for my Asian American friends, brothers and sisters, colleagues, there was no small amount of discomfort in me saying what I said. Because the nature of the marginalization is both the conversation is going to be entirely white and black. There's an intuitive sense that there's something right about that. But there's also live recognition that we're marginalized. But the third step in that progression is that we are pretty fully aware that we're not allowed to say this. Because to say it is to challenge the politics of anti-racism. And where there's been the strongest pushback is in what I describe as poking the bear of identity politics. Identity politics is such an extraordinarily powerful force in American society right now that to push the broad narrative of it, to push kind of the orthodox belief is, well, you can't be too surprised when you receive pushback from that. So the third thing I do in the book, and this is what I'm hoping we'll talk some about here, is I try to tell the story of American racism, anti-racism, where Christianity, or the church in particular, isn't just a villain. Which is not to say it isn't also a villain. Christians and the American church, or churches in America, continue to need to come to terms with our deep, deep complicity in American race and racism. This is a reality that will take us forever to come to terms with, and that's a good thing. But I also want to tell a story where Christians and Christianity and the church aren't just bad guys. How do we tell the story of the terrible things that we've done, continue to do, while also telling the story that God is not done with the church? The church's racism and complicity isn't the only thing we have to say. Why? Not on account of our own virtues, but because God isn't done with us. And so I try to tell the story of how the church can still enact viable, powerful, constructive accounts of anti-racism that challenge not the weak, convenient, individualized account of racism. If racism is, as I describe it, largely structural, systemic, then how does the church offer alternatives to those structures and systems? In here, I imagine you can think about the things that St. Albans has been doing in this city for decades, but also Christians and churches in America and around the world have been doing to offer genuinely different political economies, describing what I describe in the second half of the book, something I call deep economy, an economy of grace that pushes against the forms of inequality and exploitation, I think, that are built into American capitalism. So, and then, therefore, what I do is I try to tell the story of a church in San Francisco of Christians who basically got in the core of who they are, the sense that Jesus is on the side of the poor and disadvantaged and oppressed, and that Jesus is calling Jesus' people to the same place. And so it is a story of largely graduates of Stanford University and UC Berkeley who learn about structural systemic racism. They give up their jobs in Silicon Valley, largely as electrical engineers. You can imagine how lucrative that life would be, to move into the most marginalized part of San Francisco, start a church, and through that church start a software company, for profit I should say, that generates money that they then use the church and a school they built to redistribute money to the local community. I think churches like a place like St. Albans has extraordinary resources for exactly this kind of thing. St. Albans, as I know St. Albans, just like some of the churches I've been to in the city, draw people of significant talents and commitments, and they reimagine those talents not as comprised or given for, say, one's own personal benefit, but rather for the sake of the kingdom. And so churches that gather and do this kind of thing for the sake of their neighbors. And my sense is this is happening all over the place, all the time, that this is, in a sense, the history of Christianity. But we tend not to think that these are the primary models of Christianity. And we should shift our attention in thinking about that. So, anyways, those are the three big goals of the book. I should say the controversy around this third thing was, at least my friends in the room that are academics know this. Anytime you try to say something positive about Christianity, especially in the context of, say, racism or patriarchy or, right now, white Christian nationalism, you're going to get a lot of pushback. But I often think that there's that core there, and I've said this to some of my friends where they push back against me in, say, public context, is that I worry that there's a kind of lack of skin in the game, that the reason it's easy to complain and critique Christianity is it's easy to critique and complain about Christianity. It takes a little bit more courage to risk something by asking Christians to do more than be their worst selves. So I want Christian academics to put a little bit more skin in the game and to try to suggest more constructive alternative stories forward. So, too easy to complain. I mean, the worst versions of academia is it engenders just that kind of stuff. Whereas I think the best of academia is the celebration of the life of the mind, to think very critically about the world, but also constructively about it. Okay, that's enough. Thoughts or questions? Thank you.
As a reminder, for those of you new to Books and Authors, because we're recording, I'm going to bring the mic. If you have a question, so it picks up on the recording. So, question.
So I guess my question is mostly a practical one, which is considering this reframe of racism kind of flipped, how should that inform the DEI work, if that makes sense? So how does reframing the concept of racism reframe that work itself, if that makes sense?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's a very practical question, and I think painful for this reason. I mean, the reality of DEI work. So DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's the kind of stuff that places like Baylor University, MCC, but also most churches in America, most kind of company institutions within governments. Everyone does DEI training. The city of Waco, right, with Waco Foundation does DEI training. I've been parts of those as well. So DEI training is largely an incredible infrastructure and apparatus, a multi-billion-dollar industry at this point in American life. The point of which is they usually take place in like trainings, right? We all have been to these trainings that usually take place over 2 to 3 days. And they have what I would often, they operate on what I would largely describe, and this may be just my experience, but I don't think so, what I would describe as recitals of white guilt. The idea is we go to a DEI training to find out just how horrible a set of human beings we are. And the idea is, it's almost like an evangelical, youth retreat, right? The first couple of days they make you feel terrible, and then you have a come to Jesus moment. You feel better, but then on Sunday you go back home and nothing's really changed. I think most DEI initiatives largely work like that, and I've often wondered why we think that has achieved anything. It may be because there's such a deep recalcitrance in stubbornness to American racism that we're glad for a little white guilt. My thought is that white guilt is ultimately intentional. That is, it serves to allow the larger structures and systems to remain largely untouched. This is what I mean. It's not simply a diversion, but in some ways it is further warfare against those who suffer inequality and injustice in our society. There's a long history here. I won't get into it, but interestingly, DEI, which most of us think DEI has only been around, say, for the last decade or two. DEI has been around since the 1960s in America, and slightly early in the UK. It largely arose when the government began to recognize the reality of institutional racism and try to implement remedies to try to check it. But it also occurred in a point in our history where, think about the civil rights movement in America, in America in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. Those fights were entirely almost about structures and systems. That's why you see in Reverend Dr. King a progression from thinking about race to thinking about imperialism to thinking about capitalism. Right? He began to trace out the larger infrastructure in which these things are in place. So for folks like King, anti-racism had to address structures and systems. Otherwise, they're simply sentimentalists. Right? He writes a lot about this. Something happens, though, after the civil rights movement. Some people say internal to the civil rights movement, where there's a kind of bargain with the devil. We can either go after those structures and systems, in which we would have to dismantle large parts of our society and rethink the way we organize ourselves, or we can make racism an individual affair in a way that allows those things to go on. And so in this deal with the devil, we largely choose the latter one. The political economy that does this exploitation and inequality actually massively grows after the civil rights movement, right? This is in the 1980s, the growth of what's often called neoliberal capitalism under Reagan in the US, Thatcher in the UK. And so, interestingly, the DEI culture and industry grows up out of this. And it makes it look like we're dealing with the racism, but we're only dealing with the individualized affair. So that's the deep problem with DEI about this question about whether we can get any better on it, is that at its core, it's fundamentally misguided. Now, there are studies about how to make DEI on its own terms. Let's say you just accept the terms of what DEI does. There are ways to make it better. So, for example, Frank Dublin and his colleagues at Harvard have shown that most DEI training doesn't actually work to diversify anything. They do longitudinal studies that show 10 years after most DEI trainings, the companies not only not become more diverse, they become less diverse. And why? Well, anyone that knows anything about institutional behavior could probably guess. Anytime you start off a meeting by saying you all are, we live in a crummy society and you're to blame for it, it's going to be very hard to get people to do anything different. It's what one of Dublin's colleagues at Harvard, Mona Sue Weismark, calls the preemptive double pejorative. So there are ways to make DEI better on its own terms, but my larger concern isn't whether to improve DEI. It's whether DEI is not simply a massive diversion from the most central questions that we need to approach. So, and I'm into both remedies. I'm into making DEI better for institutions in the way you're asking, but I want us to ask these much larger questions about whether DEI really serves us in the long run as an anti-racist remedy.
So if I think about it in terms of, I work for a large Fortune 500 company that everything, and we just hired someone new, and there was diversity candidates that you must interview. There was initiatives around, or not initiative, but a real impetus to almost hire the diversity candidate, even though the other one that would be termed the non-diversity candidate was actually the better candidate. So then what do? Do we just throw affirmative action away? What's the solution? If we study it all, or we come to these conclusions and we say, okay, now we've studied it all, now what?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it largely follows the previous question. So the question, as I understand, is okay, let's say we all agree that there's deep problems and very practical problems with diversity of how we think about it. So let's say a job search. Many of us have been involved in job searches. We're on committee, and we say diversity is a high value. And then all of a sudden, we're all aware we're making decisions based on the diversity, even to the point where, let's say, we can make all things equal, right, among candidates, and we say ultimately we're making the diversity decision over and against, say, other qualifications that makes candidate B a better candidate. What do we do with that? And I take the force of the question to be, well, even though that's a problem, it is equally a problem to have an entire university, which is where I operate, as what I describe as not only white, but almost impossibly white. Like, it's hard to imagine that Baylor exists within the larger strand of, R1 universities where there's just very few non-white people at Baylor. So how do you think about this question? I don't know. I think one thing we can begin to do is to see, let's say we go with the diversity hire, is to see that as, at best, a bitter pill. Better to do that than to think that we have accomplished something morally superior than the alternative. And if we can begin to do that, then we might see it somewhat like as Jesus sees divorce. That is, I'm going to give this to you all for your hard hearts. It's not something any of us should want, but it may be necessary in certain circumstances. I think if we can at least begin to do that work, rather than what we often do alternatively, is we make the decision you just worried about, and then we throw a bunch of virtue on top of that to suggest that that was the only moral alternative option we had. But to just give you a sense of my sense of how right you are about how hard this is, I was giving a lecture on the book at Princeton, and one of my favorite kind of theorists, Asian American person, was there in the audience. And she raised her hand after my presentation, and she said, I had talked a lot about DEI stuff. And she said, love the book, love your argument, I think it's exactly right. I know every time I talk in diversity language as I don't know if any of you guys have seen some of the stuff at Princeton University around diversity, but it's super intense fights. And she says, totally agree with you. Totally agree that when I use diversity language, I'm simply reinscribing the problems that I, as a theorist, know are genuinely problems. But here's the thing. At Princeton University, there's a whole strata of deans. And if I want to get money to bring people like you to this university, I have to go speak this language. It's the same thing with hiring, with curriculum, with my relationships with my colleagues. So there may be a sense of what you're talking about, and it may even be universally shared, or at least intuited, right? I think all of us intuit that there's something wrong with this. That there's something wrong with essentializing human beings based on ascriptive identities. And yet, what do? Especially when we live in a system that incentivizes that thing. And that's where it just shows how right the black Marxists are. Right? The black Marxists are saying this is built into the world we live in, and it is going to be very, very hard for us to extricate ourselves from these realities once you commit to them. And my worry is that the anti-racism on offer is largely just pushing us way down this path. And unless you're willing to go with some very kind of left, mostly kind of socialist thinkers or black Marxists, contemporary black Marxists, then the stuff in the middle is just going to reinscribe the same sets of problems. So,
And we're going to do one more question.
This is more of a personal question. As a person of color, yourself and myself, how do you, because you've touched on how frequently diversity at work is black people and white people and that relationship. And frequently, as you mentioned, like as a Hispanic person, I am largely left out of that conversation. So I see these initiatives happening, and how have you seen them and not leaned into envy and anger that these processes are not also being applied to people, to Asian Americans or to Hispanic Americans or immigrants?
yeah, thank you for that question. So I had a little problem here, but I take what you're asking is something like this. As a person who's marginalized by the racism and the anti-racism, how do you live in that space, or the spaces we all inhabit, without kind of not fomenting or creating bitterness? And how do you offer something else? Again, I'm not entirely sure I know the answer to this question because I am pretty bitter and angry. One of the things I'm most, this may be obvious, one of the things I'm most bitter and angry about is my fellow Asian Americans, who I know these things and often will say them to me in private, while their public voice doesn't want to risk any of the pushback other than to affirm this very thing. So one of the things I've tried to do is encourage folks to kind of push these things out a little bit more, to be more public about them. But I think the most important part of what you're asking is that we need to continue to have moral commitments to those folks that continue to be pushed to the margins. And that certainly includes, say, non-black racial minorities. But it is to continue to believe in the black struggle as part of our struggle. That many of the benefits of, say, Asian Americans, right, one of the most important being the Hart-Celler Act of 1965, opened the doors for Asian migrants, right? That, of course, came exactly on the heels of the American Civil Rights Movement, which was led by African Americans. So we need to continue to see our cause as a common cause. One of the most deadly things about racism, as what I call racial capitalism, is in the same way that it pits naturally white people and black people against each other, it is going to pit people of color against each other. And until we see the way that logic operates and the real consequences on the ground, then we're going to continue to allow ourselves to be pitted. So that's the one thing, the kind of coalitional solidarity among oppressed people, marginalized people, is one of the most important moral commitments we need to have. So thank you for this question. It helped me remember to say that.
I'm going to do the really cruel thing and ask you a question that you can only say yes or no.
Okay.
Can you have capitalism without racism?
Very, very hard.
So, probably not. You're already breaking the rules.
Capitalism has built-in ideologies that justify its behavior. One of the most familiar and ready-at-hand justifications are issues of race. So there is conceptually a capitalism without racism. We just have not seen it. Another kind of question is, can you have capitalism without exploitation and domination? I try to offer an account of markets in the second half of the book that could do that, but again, that is very hard to do.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Tran. As some of you know, I'm heading up this whole thing Sunday morning, so I need to run off. But we do have some copies of the book in the back. Stephanie D will be, if you have cash, they're $30 pop. Check to St. Albans with formation books in the memo, or you can pay with my little instruction card. Otherwise, this is the end of Books and Author. So if there are any books coming up you want us to talk about, let me know, and we will do our best. And thank you again for
having
taking
me.
the
Super
long
fun.
drive, to come be with us today. Let us pray quickly. Lord, thank you for Jonathan's bold, brave, and prophetic work. We pray that what seems impossible just might be possible through the working of the Holy Spirit and through your church, if we can also be brave, courageous,